The sun had barely risen, casting a golden glow across the sleepy streets of the city, as Miss Evelyn Harris, known to everyone as Miss Evie, drove down Oakwood Avenue. In her old sedan, she was on her way to pick up groceries for her bedridden neighbor, as she had done countless times before. It was just another quiet morning, another day for the kind-hearted 65-year-old grandmother who had spent a lifetime helping others without a second thought. But what was about to unfold would change her life, and the life of an arrogant officer, forever. Miss Evie had earned the love and respect of everyone who knew her. She was the kind of person who would offer a warm hug to a stranger, bake fresh peach pies for the neighbors, and lend a hand to anyone in need. The young children in the neighborhood adored her, her infectious laughter and gentle spirit making her a beloved figure. Little did anyone know, the world was about to see a side of Miss Evie that no one had ever expected. As she parked her car behind the local pharmacy, a faint aroma of biscuits from the nearby diner teased her senses. She thought about grabbing a quick breakfast to bring back to her neighbor, maybe some scrambled eggs and a muffin. But before she could even step out of the car, something caught her attention. A young mother was struggling with a crying toddler, her face a picture of frustration. Without hesitation, Miss Evie stepped forward, offering to help. She took the heavy diaper bag from the mother's arms and whispered soothing words to the child, immediately calming the little one. The mother sighed in relief, thanking Miss Evie for her kindness. But just as she handed the diaper bag back to the mother, she heard the unmistakable sound of a car engine revving, followed by the screeching tires of a squad car that came to an abrupt stop behind her sedan. Out stepped a tall officer with a scowl etched on his face. His shiny nameplate read Officer Keller. Before Miss Evie could even ask what was going on, the officer's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Hey, hands where I can see them." His words were sharp, filled with hostility, as he rushed toward her. Miss Evie froze, her heart pounding with confusion and disbelief. What had she done wrong? She was simply helping a mother with her child. A simple, kind act. But the officer's eyes seemed to see something else. He scanned her like she was a criminal, not a grandmother just going about her day. The young mother quickly scooped up her child and hurried off, her wide eyes filled with fear. Miss Evie's pulse quickened, but she did her best to stay calm. She had lived through so many things in her life. She wasn't going to let some rude officer intimidate her. She stood there, trying to process the situation, as Officer Keller continued to bark orders at her. His partner was quietly checking the sedan's license plate, and Miss Evie couldn't help but wonder what they were looking for. She had owned her car for years, it was insured, and it was properly registered. There was no reason to treat her this way. As Keller's eyes narrowed with suspicion, she asked in a trembling voice, "Sir, is there a problem?" "I'm just." "Quiet." Keller snapped, his voice dripping with contempt as he stepped closer. His glare was icy, and Miss Evie could feel the weight of his judgment. She had seen this before, people who judged her because of her age, her appearance, and now, it seemed, because of the color of her skin. Evie's hands shook slightly as she clenched her purse, but she refused to back down. She wanted to stay polite, but the officer's hostility was unnerving. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. "I'm just trying to help someone." But Keller wasn't listening. Instead, he muttered something about random vehicle checks and unregistered cars, though Miss Evie knew her sedan had been registered for years. He ignored her protests, his voice filled with scorn. He seemed to think she was just another nobody who could be pushed around. But Miss Evie wasn't about to let him get away with it. Without warning, Keller grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the patrol car. Miss Evie stumbled, almost losing her balance. "Step away from the vehicle." He growled, his voice harsh. The humiliation washed over her like a wave. She was being treated like a criminal, and she hadn't done anything wrong. In the distance, she noticed a few people peeking through the windows of the diner, their faces pressed against the glass. They were watching her, but no one spoke up. No one stepped forward to help. It was as if they were too afraid to intervene, too afraid to stand up for what was right. The officer rifled through her purse, pulling out her personal belongings as though they were somehow evidence of a crime. Miss Evie couldn't believe what was happening. She had never experienced anything like this in her life. She had lived through the civil rights movement, seen her share of injustice, but this felt different. This felt personal. Keller slammed her purse shut and sneered, "I've had it with your attitude. You better learn how to respect law enforcement." Miss Evie's body shook with a mix of fury and disbelief. She was a grandmother, for goodness sake. She had spent her life caring for others, trying to make the world a better place, and now she was being treated like a criminal in front of a crowd of strangers. Her heart ached, not just from the mistreatment, but from the realization that no one was willing to stand up for her. No one was willing to speak out against the injustice. But just as Keller was about to pull her toward the patrol car, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from behind the pharmacy, a voice that silenced the tension in the air. "That's Evelyn Harris. She's..." Before the woman could finish her sentence, Keller shot her a glare that shut her down instantly. Miss Evie's mind raced as she realized what was happening. She was being dragged through the streets, humiliated, all because this officer had made assumptions about her. But what Keller didn't know, what no one knew, was that Miss Evie wasn't just any grandmother. She was about to become the new city judge. As the crowd held its breath, Keller's grip on her wrist tightened, but Miss Evie's heart slowed. She knew exactly what she had to do next. What would happen when Keller realized just who he was manhandling? How would he react when he discovered that he had just dragged the future judge of the city across the parking lot? The answer to that question would change everything, and you definitely won't want to miss how it all unfolds in the next part of this story. Miss Evie's heart raced as she felt the officer's grip tighten around her wrist. The indignity of it all stung deeply. She had been through so much in her life, growing up in a time when the world was a much harsher place for someone like her. She had seen the streets of her hometown flood with protests, with cries for justice, and yet here she was, in the midst of a simple act of kindness, being treated like a criminal. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and disbelief. How had things gotten so far? How had this officer, this man, made up his mind about her without knowing a single thing about who she was? As Officer Keller dragged her toward the patrol car, she tried to stay calm, to remind herself that she had lived through worse. She had seen the very worst of humanity, but she had also seen the best. She had always believed in the goodness of people, in their ability to rise above the hate and prejudice that so often clouded their judgment. But today, it felt like that belief was slipping away from her fingers like sand. The crowd that had gathered behind the diner seemed to hold their breath, watching in silence. Miss Evie could almost hear the unspoken questions that hum in the air. Why was she being treated this way? What had she done to deserve this? But no one spoke up. No one dared to challenge the officer. It was as if the fear of speaking out had paralyzed them, leaving Miss Evie to face this injustice alone. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of humiliation, there was a small spark of defiance inside her. A fire that had been burning quietly for years, ever since she had first learned about the city's legal system and its flaws. She had spent her life working with people who had been wronged, who had been ignored or mistreated. She had always fought for justice, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against her. And now, she was about to experience firsthand the very system she had dedicated her life to changing. What Officer Keller didn't know, what he could never have known, was that Miss Evie was no ordinary grandmother. She wasn't just someone who baked pies and gave warm hugs. She had spent decades working as a community activist, advocating for the rights of the underprivileged, the forgotten. She had served on local councils, attended protests, and worked tirelessly to bring about change in the city. And just a few weeks ago, after years of tireless work, she had been nominated to be the city's new judge. It had been a long and difficult road to get there. She had fought against the system that had long been stacked against people like her. People of color, people from low-income neighborhoods, people who had been overlooked and marginalized. And now, after all these years of hard work, she was about to take her place in the city's legal system as a symbol of what real change could look like. But none of that mattered to Officer Keller. To him, she was just another person to be dismissed, another black woman to be treated with disdain. As Keller continued to pull her toward the patrol car, Miss Evie's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this moment pass without doing something. She had fought too hard for too long to let an arrogant officer and his prejudice stand in her way. But what could she do? How could she possibly make him see the truth? How could she make him understand that this wasn't just some random woman he was mistreating? This was someone who had spent her life fighting for justice, who had worked tirelessly to make the world a better place. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of unspoken words and unacknowledged truths. Miss Evie could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, watching, waiting, wondering what would happen next. She knew they were all thinking the same thing. Who was this woman? Why was she being treated this way? And more importantly, why wasn't anyone standing up for her? As she struggled to keep her composure, she couldn't help but think back to the moment when she had first been offered the position of city judge. It had been a moment of triumph for her, a culmination of all the years of hard work and sacrifice she had put into her community. But it had also been a moment of fear, a fear that the world might not be ready for someone like her to take such a powerful position. She had known that people would judge her, that they would question her qualifications, her abilities. But she had never imagined that the first challenge to her authority would come in the form of a police officer dragging her across a parking lot. Keller's partner, still by the patrol car, was now circling Miss Evie's sedan, peering into the windows as though he was expecting to find something. Anything that could justify their actions. Miss Evie's eyes followed him, her mind whirling with the realization that they were looking for something that didn't exist. They were looking for a reason to make her a criminal. They were looking for something to justify the way they were treating her. And they wouldn't stop until they found it. Her thoughts were interrupted by Keller's voice, cold and dismissive. "Don't play innocent with me," he sneered. "This area's had break-ins, and I see an old clunker like yours. I figured it might be stolen, or maybe you were just scoping out someone else's property." The venom in his words hit her like a slap to the face. How could he judge her so quickly without even knowing who she was? How could he make assumptions about her based on the color of her skin, her age, her appearance? Miss Evie's blood boiled, but she knew she had to stay calm. She had to keep her composure. She had fought too hard to let this moment destroy everything she had worked for. "Clearly delivering groceries to a sick neighbor screams criminal activity, doesn't it?" she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. She forced herself to keep it steady, though every fiber of her being wanted to scream. Keller scoffed, his eyes narrowing as he glared at her. "Just keep quiet and let me do my job," he muttered, clearly not interested in hearing anything she had to say. Miss Evie's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of this, a way to make Keller understand who she really was. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that he wasn't interested in the truth. He wasn't interested in hearing her side of the story. He had already made up his mind about her, and nothing she said would change that. It was up to her to make him see the truth, and she wasn't about to back down now. But just as she was about to say something else, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from behind the pharmacy, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. "That's Evelyn Harris. She's the new judge." The voice was loud, clear, and carried through the tense silence like a thunderclap. Keller's face twisted into a mask of disbelief, and for the first time, Miss Evie saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hesitated for a moment, his grip loosening slightly on her wrist, but it was only for a moment. What would happen next? Would Keller accept the truth, or would he continue to drive Miss Evie through the mud? The tension in the air was thick, and Miss Evie knew that this moment would change everything. The words hung in the air, reverberating through the tense silence that had settled around them. "That's Evelyn Harris. She's the new judge." The voice came from behind the pharmacy, loud enough for everyone to hear. But there was no mistaking the shock in the onlookers' eyes. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the realization that they were witnessing something they hadn't expected. The grandmother they'd seen helping her neighbors, the kind woman who had always been a fixture in the community, was now being dragged by a police officer like a common criminal. And what's more, she was someone with authority, someone with power. For a brief second, Officer Keller's grip loosened on Miss Evie's wrist. His eyes flickered toward the source of the shout, his face momentarily betraying a hint of uncertainty. The hard, judgmental expression he wore faltered, just enough to reveal a crack in his armor. He looked at her, then really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. But it was too late for him to simply back off and pretend this had been a mistake. His pride wouldn't let him. Instead, there was a flash of anger, a stubborn refusal to admit that he had been wrong. Miss Evie's heart pounded against her chest as her pulse quickened. She could see it in Keller's eyes. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the image of the elderly black woman he had been bullying with the new judge he had just been told she was. His partner, who had been rummaging through her glove compartment, froze in place, eyes wide with shock. There was a momentary hesitation, but Keller quickly regained his composure, masking his doubt with a sneer. "What's this? Some kind of joke?" He muttered, barely looking at her. "You're just some little old lady. Don't try to pull that crap on me." Miss Evie felt a surge of frustration rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. She knew that fighting fire with fire wouldn't help her now. "I've worked my entire life to get where I am," she said, every word laced with the weight of years of hard work, dedication, and sacrifice. "I am the new judge. I was appointed to serve this city, to make sure people like you don't get to make decisions about others' lives based on your prejudice." Keller's eyes flashed with contempt. But there was something different now. Perhaps it was the realization that he had just crossed a line he couldn't take back, or the discomfort of facing someone who wasn't cowering in fear. His grip tightened slightly, but Miss Evie stood her ground. She knew that every second this standoff continued, his credibility was eroding, and the pressure was building. The crowd that had gathered was starting to murmur in disbelief, some of them even daring to take out their phones to record the scene. Keller's partner, still silent, finally spoke up. "Keller, maybe we should." "No," Keller snapped, cutting him off before the words could even form. He turned his attention back to Miss Evie, his voice low and threatening. "I don't care who you are. You're not above the law. You don't get to dictate how I do my job." Miss Evie exhaled sharply, her mind working quickly. She couldn't let this man escalate things any further. She had spent far too much of her life fighting for justice, for the rights of the people who had been silenced for too long. She wasn't about to let some racist cop drag her through the dirt. Not today. But as she opened her mouth to respond, something unexpected happened. From the corner of her eye, she saw a figure approach, walking steadily and with purpose. It was a tall man, his face familiar. The crowd parted, and the figure stepped forward, his eyes locked on Officer Keller with an intensity that made the air between them feel electric. "Officer Keller," the man said, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable authority. "Is there a problem here?" Keller's eyes darted toward the newcomer, his expression hardening again, but he didn't immediately respond. The man, however, wasn't fazed by the tension. He stepped closer, the weight of his presence making it clear that he wasn't some passerby or curious onlooker. He was someone who mattered. Miss Evie recognized him immediately. It was Mayor Charles Lawson, the same man who had been instrumental in her appointment as the new judge. He had been one of her biggest supporters, and his reputation in the city was one of respect, a man who stood for fairness. Her heart sank as she wondered what he might do in this moment. She had no doubt that Keller knew who he was, but would he back down? "Keller," the mayor repeated, his voice now tinged with authority. "I don't think this is how we handle things in this city, is it?" Keller's jaw clenched, and for a moment it seemed like he might challenge the mayor. But the weight of the mayor's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Keller hesitated. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. It was as if every eye in the small crowd was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. "I'm just doing my job," Keller muttered, but there was a new edge to his voice now. It was offensive, almost as if he feared being called out. "We had reports of suspicious activity in this area, and I'm doing what's necessary." The mayor's gaze didn't soften, And you thought this elderly woman was involved in that? He gestured toward Miss Evie. You're making a mistake, officer. I suggest you let her go now. I'm fine, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. She nodded toward the crowd, which had begun to disperse, some still murmuring about the confrontation. It's not over yet. The mayor gave her a sharp look as if sensing the unease in her words. What do you mean? Miss Evie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Keller's not the only problem. He's just a symptom of the larger issue. There's a system here, one that doesn't want to change, and he's not the only one who's going to make things difficult. The mayor's face darkened, his jaw tightening in frustration. I know. I've been fighting this battle for years, but now with you as judge, maybe we can start making some real changes. I hope so, she said softly, but doubt lingered in her voice. I don't know if they're ready for it. I don't know if I'm ready for it. The weight of the responsibility that had been placed on her shoulders was starting to press down harder than ever. She had accepted the role of judge, had fought to be there, but the reality of it was more daunting than she had expected. There were people in the city who would do everything in their power to undermine her, to keep the status quo intact. And Keller was just the beginning. As the mayor walked away, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own exhaustion, Miss Evie stood there, rooted to the spot. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street, and the world around her seemed to breathe a little easier. But the fight was far from over. The next few days were a blur of appointments, paperwork, and tense meetings. Miss Evie couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beneath the surface. Keller's threat had been ominous, but there was more to it than just him. There were others who had never been held accountable for their actions, others who believed they could control the city with their wealth and influence. And then came the phone call. It was late one night, just as Miss Evie was finishing up some paperwork in her office. The screen of her phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. A cold knot formed in her stomach as she answered, her voice steady but cautious. Miss Harris, the voice on the other end said, low and clipped. You don't know me, but I think you should know what's coming. Miss Evie's heart skipped a beat. Who is this? I'm someone who knows what's going on behind the scenes, the voice continued, its tone deliberate. Someone who knows what Keller's been up to. And I'm not the only one who's been watching. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. What do you mean? She asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Let's just say you've made some enemies, powerful ones, and they won't stop until they've taken you down. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The words lingered in the silence like a threat, a dark promise of something yet to come. Miss Evie stood frozen, the weight of the call settling over her like a suffocating cloud. She had made enemies, yes, but now the question was, how far were they willing to go? And how far was she willing to go to fight back? As the minutes ticked by, Miss Evie's resolve hardened. She wouldn't back down. She couldn't. But the uncertainty of the future loomed large. What was the next move? What was the game they were playing? And how far would it go before someone was forced to make a choice? In the distance, she heard the sound of sirens wailing, and for a moment it felt like the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. The sirens wailing in the distance grew louder, their urgency echoing through the empty streets outside. Miss Evie stood frozen, her phone pressed to her ear, the line now silent. The words from a mysterious caller still reverberated in her mind. You've made some enemies, powerful ones. The warning had been cryptic, but the sense of danger it carried felt all too real. As she sat there, her mind racing, she felt the sharp sting of isolation. She had walked into this role with the intention of changing things, of fighting for justice. But now she was facing something far darker, far more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Her enemies weren't just shadowy figures lurking in the background. They were deeply entrenched in the city's very foundation. They were power players who had lived in the shadows for years, their influence woven through every corner of the system. And now they knew who she was. They knew what she was capable of. The phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. This time, the number was familiar, Detective Daniels. Miss Harris, you need to get down here. It's urgent. Daniels' voice was strained, his words clipped. What's going on? Miss Evie's pulse quickened, sensing the tension in his tone. It's Keller. He's involved in something bigger. We just got a tip, and you need to see this for yourself. Meet me at the precinct. Now. Keller's face reddened, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Miss Evie saw something she hadn't expected. Doubt. Keller was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. He had made a decision, assumed something about Miss Evie, and now he was being confronted with the consequences of his actions. The mayor turned to Miss Evie, his expression softening. Are you okay, Judge Harris? He asked quietly, his voice full of concern. I'm fine, Miss Evie replied, her voice steady but still tinged with the anger she had been holding back. I've been through worse, but this doesn't make it any easier. Keller, still standing close by, looked between the two of them, his eyes flicking nervously. He was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. I'm just doing my job, he repeated, as if hoping to justify his actions. The mayor finally turned fully toward Keller, his voice cold now. Your job is to serve and protect, not to harass innocent people. I suggest you remember that before this gets any worse. Keller's shoulders stiffened, and for a moment he looked like he was about to argue again. But the reality of the situation was dawning on him. The eyes of the crowd were on him, the mayor was standing right there, and he was already on the verge of making a major mistake. The power dynamics had shifted in an instant. Miss Evie could feel the shift in the air. She had faced so much in her life, and now finally there was a sense of reckoning. But she couldn't let her guard down just yet. What would Keller do next? Would he walk away, or would he fight back, trying to salvage his pride at all costs? The uncertainty lingered in the air, thick and heavy, as the tension between the two men built to a breaking point. The air between the mayor and Officer Keller was thick, charged with the weight of the crowd's judgment. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, whispers of disbelief and curiosity swirling around them. It felt like time had slowed, every second stretching out as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Keller's eyes flickered nervously between the mayor and the gathered crowd. He was trapped, surrounded by eyes that weren't just watching, but also judging. His hand tightened around the baton at his waist, and for a moment, Miss Evie feared he might lash out, trying to regain control. But something in the mayor's gaze, a quiet, unyielding strength, seemed to paralyze him. Keller hesitated, his pride warring with the realization that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The mayor took a step closer, his presence undeniably commanding. I'm not asking you again, Keller, he said, his voice low but firm. Let her go. Miss Evie felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Fear. It was a strange feeling, considering she had spent so many years fighting battles, standing firm against injustice, but the tension in the air had a new weight to it. She looked into Keller's eyes, trying to gauge his next move. He was unpredictable, a man who had shown himself capable of cruelty, and she wasn't sure if he would back down or double down in an attempt to prove something to himself. But as the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity, Keller's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight draining out of him. He seemed to shrink under the pressure, the authority of the mayor, the crowd, and the undeniable truth of the moment weighing on him. His hand dropped from the baton, and for the first time, Miss Evie saw the officer's arrogance falter. It was a small victory, but one she had earned with years of perseverance, with the courage that had gotten her through the hardest parts of her life. But the sense of victory was short-lived. Don't think you've won? Keller spat, his voice dripping with bitterness, his eyes still burning with anger. This isn't over, Harris. You're going to regret this. With that, he turned on his heel and stormed back to his car, his partner following closely behind. But the weight of his threat lingered, hanging in the air like an unanswered question. What would Keller do next? Would he try to make good on his promise, or was this just another empty boast from a man who had been exposed for who he really was? As the patrol car drove off, The crowd exhaled collectively, a sense of relief sweeping through the onlookers. But Miss Evie didn't feel the same sense of closure. She knew this wasn't over. Keller's words echoed in her mind. "You're going to regret this." What did he mean by that? Was he just lashing out in frustration, or was something more sinister brewing in the background? The mayor turned to Miss Evie, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked quietly, his voice softened by the weight of the moment. The line went dead before she could ask any more questions. Her instincts screamed at her to move, and without hesitation she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. The night air bit at her skin as she made her way to the car, her mind racing with the possibilities. Could Keller really be part of something larger? The thought gnawed at her as she sped through the darkened streets, every turn bringing her closer to the unknown. When she arrived at the precinct, Daniels was waiting outside, his face grim and his eyes scanning the parking lot nervously. He motioned for her to follow him inside, his movements quick and deliberate, as if he were trying to outrun something. Inside, the precinct felt colder than usual, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as they made their way down a narrow hallway. Daniels led her to a small room at the back, where a few officers were gathered around a table, staring down at a series of files and photographs. "What's this about?" Miss Evie asked, her voice low. Daniels didn't answer immediately. He just nodded toward the table. Miss Evie walked over and peered down at the contents spread across the surface. The first image that caught her eye was a photograph of Keller, but it wasn't just any photo. It was a surveillance shot taken from a distance, showing him meeting with someone in a dark alley late one night. The figure he was speaking to was partially obscured, but there was something in the way they stood that felt wrong. The posture, the way the person seemed to loom over Keller, exuding authority. Daniels leaned in beside her. "That's not the worst of it. We've been tracking Keller's movements for a while now, but it's not just him we've been following." He flipped through the pages, revealing more photos, shots of high-profile businessmen, city officials, and even a few familiar faces from the police department, all meeting in secret with Keller. Each of them had ties to the very system she had been trying to reform. Powerful people, some with connections that spanned beyond the city limits. Her stomach twisted. "What is this?" Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's a network, Miss Harris. A web of corruption, and Keller's at the center of it. These aren't just random meetings, these are calculated. They're planning something big, and it's happening under our noses." She stared at the photos, each one painting a larger picture of the corruption and manipulation that had been happening in the city for years. What had she walked into? Was this the reason Keller had reacted so violently when she had stood up to him? The files on the table weren't just about Keller. They were about the people who had been pulling the strings all along. She had made an enemy of Keller. But this was much bigger than just one man. This was a coordinated effort, a carefully constructed plan to keep the city's power in the hands of a select few. And now, with her new position as judge, she was a threat to everything they had built. A chill ran down Miss Evie's spine. The stakes had just been raised. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for her life. Daniels seemed to sense the shift in the air. "We need to get ahead of this now. If we don't, they'll bury us before we'd even get started." His eyes locked with hers, his voice steady but urgent. "We can't trust anyone. Not in here. Not even the people you think you can rely on." As the weight of his words settled over her, Miss Evie felt the walls closing in. She had come into this fight with a sense of purpose, but now she was faced with a reality that threatened to swallow her whole. Every person she had trusted, every ally she had hoped would stand by her, could now be working against her. The shadowy network of corruption went deeper than she could have imagined, and its reach was far more extensive than she realized. The room seemed to close in on her as the seconds stretched into minutes. She could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, their sterile glow casting an eerie pallor over the officers gathered around the table. They were all silent now, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't know what to say. She didn't know where to begin. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now? Daniel's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of uncertainty in his gaze. I don't know, but we can't back down. Not now. Not after everything we've uncovered. As the weight of his words settled in, Miss Evie felt a cold sense of determination wash over her. She had come too far to turn back now. The battle had just begun, and she would need every ounce of strength she had to survive what was coming next. But as they gathered the files and prepared to leave the precinct, Miss Evie couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them. Someone who knew they were onto something. Someone who was ready to strike first. And she wasn't sure she was ready for what would happen next. The tension was palpable, the storm gathering on the horizon. Everything she had fought for, everything she had worked so hard to achieve, was now at risk. And the worst part, she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore.